This brief video is about text complexity. I think it's something worth talking about as we consider the careful selection of the text that we're using with students in our classrooms. So one of the things that I've noticed and that I've come across in working with other teachers around the area is that a lot of people are basing their text selection that's not in the series that they're using. So like when they're going to grab other articles or other resources, they're basing the text they picked solely on Lexile levels. And what a Lexile level is a quantitative measure of a text. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But when we consider text complexity, the purpose of this video is to discuss how there are other factors that we need to consider. Okay, so for example, when I say that a Lexile level is a quantitative measure, what a Lexile level is doing is just measuring the complexity of the words in a sentence, how frequent certain words are appearing in a text, the length of the word, like the number of syllables that a word has. It's looking at the length of the sentences in the text. So you're purely getting a numerical value based on numbers, essentially. So the question I have on the screen is, what are the limitations of evaluating complexity using only quantitative factors? Well, if we think of that, the novella of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, if you're familiar with that, it has a Lexile level of 630. So if we take a look at this screen quickly, and we look at these grade spans, and what you see here is the Lexile framework. So what grade level the Lexile score corresponds with. And then there's also a Strex Lexile band. So if you wanted to stretch students with more complex texts, what the recommended Lexile band is for the grade level. So back to Of Mice and Men, if it has a Lexile level of 630, where does it place on this chart according to grade level? Well, if we can see here, grades 2 to 3 has a Lexile framework of 450 to 630. Now, think of the content of Mice and Men. Is that appropriate for a second or third grade student? Hopefully you said no, because it is not appropriate for a second or third grade student. Based on Lexile level, a second or third grade student might be able to read that text. They can read the words, they can read the sentences, but it is not a text suitable for them. And so if we only use those quantitative measures, we're missing a lot about text complexity. So we also have to consider the qualitative factors, and that's the quality of the text rather than the quantity. And we also have to think about the reader, the individual reader, and then the task. So what are we asking the reader to do with this text? We have to consider those things as well. So when we look at qualitative factors, the things that make a text quality, here are some of the things that we need to consider. Number one, knowledge demands. So we're really thinking about, okay, using Of Mice and Men again, what do my students know about the Great Depression? What do they know about migrant workers? If they don't know anything about these things, what do I need them to know before they can access the text? So a little bit of background knowledge there. Number two, meaning and purpose. If a text has a singular meaning, it's going to be easier to read than a text that has multiple meanings. So for example, if you think of a poem that might have a figurative and a literal meaning, that is going to be more complex than something that just has one meaning. Likewise, I always taught the play The Crucible. On the surface, the text has one meaning, but it's an allegory. It stands for a totally different thing. So those texts are more complex. Number three is text structure. Texts that are structured chronologically are less complex to read and access than texts that are not structured chronologically. So if a text has flashback or flash forward, if a text uses a complex structure like problem and solution or cause and effect, those texts are going to be more complex. Number 4 is language features. If the text has a lot of simple, direct language, obviously it's going to be less complex than a text that uses a lot of figurative language. The more metaphors and similes and things that students have to dissect, think about the meaning and how the meaning applies to the overall meaning of the text, then those language features are going to increase complexity. And then finally, number 5 are visual supports. Visual supports like graphs, charts, pictures. A lot of times they can help make a text less complex, but depending on what the visual support is and the type of visual support and the complexity of the visual support actually might make it more difficult to read than helpful. So those are all things that we need to consider as well. And then finally, the reader and task. So again, the reader, so the individual person, what's the complexity of the content? Again, of Mice and Men, are students mature enough to deal with the fact that someone murders someone else at the end of the text? We have to think about that. Cognitive capabilities is another issue that we need to consider. We want students to interact with the text and understand it and be able to discuss it. So we don't want to give them something that is so complex that they can't read it. That kind of relates to reading skills. Like, even if a student has higher cognitive capabilities, what individual reading skills do they actually have in order to help them comprehend a text? What's their motivation and engagement? We know that this is a huge factor whenever we're teaching in the classroom. And if there isn't motivation and engagement, or there's not high motivation and engagement, what can we do to try to increase that a little bit? So we have to consider that. Prior knowledge of the student. You're sitting in a class, and I've said this many times, I've had students in the same class who have traveled out of the country and students that had never been to Pittsburgh. So vast range of prior knowledge. With that in mind, how can we tap into the prior knowledge of the classroom and increase the overall prior knowledge of the students as a whole? These are all things we have to consider. And then finally, tasks and assessments. What am I going to ask the student to do with this text? Am I going to ask them to summarize it? Less complex of a task than if I ask them to analyze 2 specific elements of the text. And then how am I going to assess students on these tasks? These are all things that we need to consider in text complexity. So again, if we go back to this triangle, we really have to think about text complexity in a much, much broader and deeper sense than just looking at Lexile level.